Welcome to the Success Consultancy's Just Great People podcast, the podcast that introduces you to ordinary people who've done extraordinary things. My name is Barry Eustance, and I'd like to introduce you to today's guest. Hi, everybody. It's Barry Eustance here from the Just Great People podcast. I'm joined for the first time in 18 months by Rick Leander. Rick is a founder and board advisor, looks after decision quality under uncertainty, a perfect positioning, I would say, for our current geopolitical environment, and applied behavioural economics. Rick is a friend of the program, was here in August 18 months ago, and we've got a lot to catch up on. Rick, welcome from Thailand.
Thank you, Barry. It's good to be here again. Good to see you.
Yeah, and just a bit of background. Rick, rather than me run through your capacious CV, would you just like to give a bit of a couple of touch points and reference points for our dear listener?
Sure. Spent the first major chunk of my career as an international corporate banker. Spent a lot of time in places like London, New York, and Tokyo. Then through a series of fortunate events, got into the entrepreneurial world, first as an investor running a fairly large investment fund, then ran a new business incubator, did corporate innovation challenges, was the CEO of a fintech startup in New York that we ended up selling. And for about the last 18 years now, have spent most of my time working with early stage companies, either directly or through entrepreneurial service organizations, helping them do a better job of what they're trying to do.
Yeah, and also a major career, as you say, in banking as CEO of AIG and Trust and fintech, or MD Strategic Tech, wasn't it, for Bank of America? Is that correct?
Yep. Yeah, that is actually how I got into the entrepreneurial world. We set up the Strategic Technology Group at Bank of America with the task of identifying emerging technologies that would be useful for the institution to leverage. And as part of that, we came across companies that were fairly early stage and needed funding. And so what we decided to do was, the first time we discovered this was actually when a friend of mine who was a VC called to find out if the signature on the contract was actually mine. And I said, yes. And why are you calling? And he said, well, we're about to invest in them. And he told me what the valuation was. And I gasped because we had looked at the valuation 6 weeks before and it was considerably lower. And so I called my team together and said, we're never doing that again. If our efforts are going to help somebody raise a lot of money, we're going to be part of that equation. So we ended up setting up a fairly large strategic investing fund and invested in a lot of companies all over the world. In fact, the first one was a company in Australia. But it was a really powerful way to do two things. We were trying to identify technology that the institution could use, but we were also trying to be smart about how technology was emerging and how that might impact the businesses that we were running. So it was a two-way flow and worked very well.
Right. And fast forward to today, you've added to that, in addition to your one-to-one advisory for transformation technology, decision quality under uncertainty, which aligns very much, as we were discussing very briefly before we hit the record button, about our own executive decision acceleration program. Rick, decision quality under uncertainty. Give me your take on where we are in that process, geopolitically and generally.
I think there's more uncertainty than ever, and I think what's interesting, and I had a conversation with an acquaintance of mine who's reasonably well connected inside the U.S. political system, and he had some interesting things to say, and a lot of it revolved around the fact that the problem identification that's going on tends to not be too far out of whack. I mean, there are clearly some things that need to get fixed. It's the decisions around what we're going to do to solve those problems that seem so out of whack, seem so out of kilter, seem so out of balance with what most people would think is sort of the normal, or not the normal, but would be prudent. And just as we're seeing in the geopolitical scene, we see this in companies all the time, right? I mean, one of the famous quotes about startups is most of them die from suicide, not from homicide. And when you really analyze that, what you find out is that a lot of it is because decisions were made poorly, that there was information that could have been tapped or information that was misunderstood. And then you feed that through the behavioral economic lenses of the sort of decision biases that we all have. And you find out that a lot of these companies ended up like shooting themselves because they made decisions that they probably shouldn't have made.
The question I think that will be on a lot of people's mind at the moment is the plethora of information that's coming out, some of it completely unaudited, unguarded from the GPTs, the large language models, and that you ask a simple question, you get almost a right answer. So you reiterate and reiterate and reiterate, and 126 pages later, you've got an answer, but it's forgotten what it said at the beginning of the conversation, which you have to pick up. So you're actually getting you're getting a cumulative effect of a built-in error percentage from the GPTs. And is that, do you think, translating through to A, the quality of the decisions that have been taken, and B, the speed at which those are taken now? Is it slowing stuff down? Are people getting mired in the weed?
I think in some cases they are. Unfortunately, in a lot of cases, it's speeding up the bad stuff. It turns out that the large language models feed into a fairly common decision bias, which is confirmation bias. The whole idea behind confirmation bias is we tend to grab onto the stuff that confirms the beliefs that we had or that we were leaning toward, and we disregard the stuff that clearly points us in a different direction. And as bad as that is, it's not the most insidious part. The most insidious part is that we end up taking the stuff that really is kind of neutral and interpreting it in a way that confirms our bias. And we see this a lot in the large language models in terms of the way our clients, people in general, do the prompting, right? The engineering prompts are everything, or to a large degree, a lot of what happens in these large language models. And it turns out the large language models in some ways are actually pretty smart in that they, based on the way you ask questions, gives them some insight into what you're looking for. And so we've actually been working with somebody out of Chicago recently from one of the large universities, and he's been really good about showing the order in which you pose information and then the ultimate question determines to a large degree the answer you get from a model. So provide information first and then ask the question, or then ask the question and then provide the data that it's supposed to analyze. You can get very different kinds of responses.
And so is the implication of that is it's actually absorbing, in addition to its own bias, your own confirmation bias as you prompt it. Yeah, interesting.
Yeah,
And potentially deadly.
Yeah, absolutely. I just listened to a fascinating conversation recently with somebody who said the problem with these large language models is they tend to really not learn by themselves. Their starting point is what humans tell them, right? They learn from the environment first, and that environment has biases built into it.
Yeah.
So, it doesn't start with a neutral data set. It starts with a data set that already has biases built into it. And of course, the other thing we know, and this has been true about the internet since it got started, is we tend to confuse data with information. And most of what's on the internet, and I would suggest a big chunk of what comes out of these large language models, is actually just a form of data. And you need time and training and some level of skill to translate data into information, and even more time and energy and skill to translate it into actionable intelligence. And most people get lazy and just don't do the work and assume that the raw data actually is pointing them to an answer.
And that's an important differentiation to make, isn't it? What is the difference between data and information? And for many people, as you say, that division isn't apparent. Could you possibly articulate what your perspective is on that, Rick?
Not very crisply or clearly. This is like about a 4-hour conversation when we get started on it, but it's basically this notion of you can imagine, if you think about computer languages, right? You can think about sort of the basic zeros and ones that a computer actually operates on is data. And it's worthless to most of it, right? You take a look at basic computer code, and most of us wouldn't have a clue what it actually means, right? It takes somebody who's skilled and trained to figure out what the zeros and ones are to actually figure out what the computer program is trying to do, and then make the adjustment so that it actually does what it's supposed to do. A lot of the stuff that's going on the internet is the same thing. It's well, sort of a real life example that has occurred in the political system in the US. People without any knowledge of the way election processes work with ballots and counting and all that stuff, take a look at processes, take a look at the raw data, take a look at a video and go, oh my God, look at all these terrible things that are going on, not realizing that all these steps are documented and clear. I remember a specific example of a woman who decided that there was massive fraud going on in mail-in ballots in Arizona because she'd had a ballot sent to her old address and then she moved and got a ballot sent to the new address, and then used this as an example of how people could get multiple ballots and vote multiple times. And when they sat down with the folks who run the elections in Arizona, they go, no, they're all barcoded. They're barcoded to a specific voter. And once we see one that comes in for Rick Leander, if we had to send out duplicates because he said he lost it or he changed his address, we already know that we've got one with his vote on it and we don't allow any more in.
Yeah.
So the data certainly appears like Rick's got multiple ballots and can do something with them, not understanding how the system has actually got all kinds of controls. So that's kind of a political example, but that stuff goes on all the time. It's one of the reasons, frankly, and I'm going to pontificate a little, but our increasing focus on sort of downplaying expertise and deciding that experts really don't matter, that everybody has a voice and everybody should have an opinion on stuff. And, there's a reason why we have experts, because they're supposed to know stuff that the rest of us don't know.
Yeah, absolutely.
Anyway, I'm off on a rant here, and I should
No,
stop.
well, no, but that's the whole point. In fact, as I say, because this is something that both you and I, quite separately, by the way, folks, we didn't collaborate on this, but the whole question of executive decision acceleration and Rick's decision quality under uncertainty actually come from the same point, and that is that turning data into information and executable information, reliable information, where critical thinking is applied, cutting out the noise, getting rid of all the peripheral stuff that isn't important, to drill down to the core issue that will help you arrive at critically appraised decision without taking forever or getting so bogged down in the weeds that no decision is ever taken, I think is something that is uniquely human, frankly, because we are dealing, whatever you may say about artificial intelligence, and this may be my rant, Rick. So, dear listener, I apologize, but it's the reality, isn't it? Ultimately, the ultimate stakeholder of AI are humans, and the human interaction and interpretation and critical analysis of that is vital to effective decision making. And it goes back to the discussion I had previously about jumping in an airplane in Thailand and flying to New York with just AI flying you. Are you going to do it? Question mark.
Not anytime soon.
Not anytime soon. And that's the quality of the human in the loop, making critical decisions upon which there is a mutually assured destiny. And Rick, how does that then play out to our entrepreneurs, our tech investors, anybody actually who's listening to this podcast who wants to go out and enter the world of entrepreneurialism with all of the, and actually, I wonder if you can just run through some of the pitfalls of that particular journey. And I refer you back to Rick's previous podcast, 18 months ago, by the way, August 2024, where Rick identified some of the pains of not getting rich quickly by being an entrepreneur might bring to your journey. But Rick, over to you. Just a little refresher, everybody, and see whether age has become determined in Rick's delivery here.
Yeah, as I recall, we talked about the three things that we absolutely guarantee every founder will live with, and the one thing we can almost always guarantee will not happen, right? And the three things that we guarantee are: you're going to be under massive stress, you're going to have money, you're going to have stress in general, one, you're going to have money problems specifically, number two, and number three, it's going to screw up relationships at some level. Those three things happen consistently. They happen all the time. They're just a given. You should know. And the thing that we guarantee almost never happens is that you get rich. And the reason for going through that list with founders is they need to get that in their heads, and the people who work with them and support them need to get that in their heads, and then realize that what you really ought to be focusing on are things that you're passionate about, right? Real problems that need to be solved. And I in my vernacular, when I talk about real problems, the problem that I want to help people solve is not, gee, let's help a big corporation improve their margins by 10%, right? Just not interested, right? So a lot of the stuff that we have worked on historically have been human centered technology, healthcare, fintech, particularly for low and moderate income household kind of fintech stuff. Ed tech is another area where where we played a bunch of stuff. Those are kind of the guide rails that we try and talk people to and say, as I said, right, be passionate about this because it's going to be long and tough and painful. And at the end of the day, there's probably not a pot of gold. You're probably going to get rewarded because you feel better that you help solve a problem or you move the ball along.
Yeah, and there's not a lot in life that's more satisfying than delivering genuine value to people or a group of people or a team of people, and particularly those whose kind of values align with yours. That's got to be a prime motivator, isn't it? And I think it is why you get up every day. If you get up every day to get rich, that's got an interesting dynamic to it.
Or to help the big corporation that you're working for improve their margins by 0.01%.
Yeah.
I spent a chunk of my life doing that work, and it wasn't nearly as satisfying as I thought it was going to be.
No. And so if we canter gently across to the next paddock and have a look at decision quality under uncertainty, we've just identified geopolitical uncertainty from a corporate perspective, uncertainty from an entrepreneurial perspective, and of course the uncertainty that surrounds us all given the current environment in which we're operating. Decision quality under uncertainty, Rick, how do we get better at it? How does that play out? What's your model for?
Yeah. There's an interesting book that I'm currently plowing through. It's called Noise, and it's written by three folks in the behavioral economics world, including Daniel Kahneman, who won the Nobel Prize in Economics for his work in this field. And Noise makes the case that decisions are influenced by two factors that are equally pernicious. One is bias, which behavioral economics has tended to focus on, and we can talk about some of those things in a second. But this book highlights, I think, in some very strong ways that the other thing that impacts decisions is noise. That a lot of what you think is valuable, a lot of what you think is important is actually just noise, and figuring out a way to extract that noise in the data set can go a long way toward improving the quality of the decisions that you make. So, like I said, I'm only halfway through this thing. I just recently discovered it. A friend of mine turned me on to it. So it'll be interesting to see how the learnings from Daniel's latest book inform some of the work that we do with early stage founders. Because, like I said, right now it's focused very heavily on the kinds of biases that behavioral economics has identified. Things like we've talked about on confirmation bias, right? This notion that we tend to really grasp onto the data or the information that we think we have that supports a view we've already gotten. There's the notion of anchoring, which is the very first piece of data that you get on a particular subject kind of sets the tone. So if the first thing you hear about a movie is negative, you're likely to think it's negative even when you go to see it. And if the first thing you hear is positive, then you get excited and you tend to think positively about it. That applies not just for movies, it applies for just about everything you might stumble across. And then there are things like sunk cost fallacy and the danger of groupthink. And there's just a whole range of things that go on that we know impact the way people make decisions. And as Dan Ariely and others have said, the problem with knowing all this stuff is it doesn't mean you're still not susceptible to it, right? We still get into situations and then looking back after the fact, go, oh my gosh, look what we just did. We just did what we said we weren't going to do, or we weren't going to be, we were going to be particularly careful about that issue. And so one of the things that we do in this decisioning process to help people make better decisions is we've done I think in our first conversation about this stuff, we talked about the role kind of emerging as a happy curmudgeon. What we've really done is done a much better job of formalizing it into something that looks very much like a devil's advocate role that the Catholic Church used to have, right? The idea that somebody is specifically tasked with coming up with the conversation, the data, the information, the arguments about why you shouldn't do something that you're about to do. The Catholic Church used to run this process for people that were in the later stages of being proposed to become saints, right? So one of the last steps was they assigned a devil's advocate, and their job was to figure out all the reasons why Barry shouldn't be a saint and put all that information on the table so that you actually had a balanced view.
I could add it to my own list, actually, Rick.
Yeah. And so, and just to be clear, this isn't the Monty Python argument thing where you just say the opposite of what the other person has said, right? This is thoughtful and hard work and reasoned and balanced, but you assign somebody specifically to make sure that the right questions have been asked, that the answers that have been given are complete, that the data set that you're looking at is as complete as possible. And as part of that process, looking at, so how did we get to the point where we're prepared to make this decision? And where are the places where we didn't follow good processes or procedures, or where we may have failed to do something? And you can do that on big, hairy strategic stuff. You really can't do it in the moment of a crisis. But if you have put together a process that helps make decisions for these long-term strategic stuff, you've at least got some muscle memory to deal with when the emergency comes up, and you've got some sense for how to play.
Yeah, and that actually covers beautifully the processes that we applied in my previous incarnation as an airline captain. And the particular case I quoted is when I had a fuel leak mid-Atlantic, which is an interesting thing at 4 a.m. coming back from Chicago in a 4-engine jet. 4 engines, good, very good idea. And actually, there's your crisis, right? So there are a number of possible outcomes. Quite a lot of them are bad. And so how do you avoid those outcomes? And of course, the preparation for that and the muscle memory, the standard operating procedures, the interaction, how you interplay with stakeholders in the process, who do you talk to, who don't you talk to, and how do you communicate? And also, what do you do to contain the situation initially? So that you remember to fly the airplane, not, as happened, checking a 10-cent bulb and flying at 10-11 into the Everglades. And so always fly the airplane. Mm-hmm. And that's such an important element of, you have a crisis. Look, any organization is going to have a crisis at some point, and it's going to be public, and it could be existential. It could have many features on it. So how are you going to cope with it? Because if you haven't rehearsed it and you haven't got procedures that will actually get you through that initial critical phase, you've got some quite significant issues to overcome when a crisis hits. And it is that always that check at the end. You review it and say, okay, what have we missed? What is it that we've missed? And who's the person who's going to do that? Is it the most junior person on the airplane who's sitting in the rear gallery goes, by the way, I think you should know. And that's the kind of mindset that saves lives and actually can make some really good decisions, really effective decisions, in my experience. So interesting. And so how do what do you think, Rick? Is culturally, are we being seduced at the moment by AI into taking less critically analytical decisions, or are we over analyzing? What are we doing as a species at the moment? Where's our bias?
I think we're doing both. I think we're doing both. I think we're, on the one hand, getting lazy and turning, asking a few questions and then, off to the races we go because some smart computer in the clouds told me to do something. On the other hand, I've got clients who are spending hours every day with sometimes a free, sometimes a paid version of one of the large language models, asking every conceivable question you could think of. because you ask a question and it, you know, spits out an answer. And then it's like so much of the early days of the web where you sort of ask a question intending to do X, and 5 hours later, you're just buried down in the middle of nothing. So I think we're both using it as a shortcut when we need to be more thoughtful, and then oftentimes dissecting to the smallest degree some things that don't really matter.
Yeah. Yeah. And so that decision quality under uncertainty, if we were to take, as you did so eruditely, the three things that are going to trip you up or certainly you're going to encounter as an entrepreneur, what do you think your wisdom is on decision quality under uncertainty? What are your thoughts? The simple guidelines.
I really do think now more than ever, you need somebody around your table who's smart and curious, who's tasked with trying to figure out why what you're thinking is wrong. We may have talked about this in our first conversation. I don't remember, but Paul Sappho from the Institute of the Future out in California introduced me to this concept of strong opinions loosely held. And he was very big on this notion that when you start investigating something or start looking at something or start thinking about something, don't be afraid to come up with an opinion early on, because you know what? You're going to do it anyway. So you might as well just embrace it. Just know that that's the way the process is going to work. But then the next chunk of work ought to be to figure out why that initial impression is wrong. So I love the concept of, because what are we talking about, right? We're talking about the scientific process of coming up with a hypothesis and then trying to figure out why it's wrong, right?
Yeah.
Spending. So this notion, I think, of actually having a cultural mindset that says we're going to actively challenge the opinions, the decision, the opinions, the beliefs that we have. You know, a couple of things that used to work for me, sometimes they work for me when I was in the large corporate world, is whenever I took a new job, one of the things I would ask is, so what are the things that we can't do anything about? And they go, oh, well, we can't do anything about this, and we're kind of stuck with this, and we're kind of stuck with that. And I'd grab a couple of people and say, your job's to figure out how we do something about the things we can't do anything about. And you know what? The truth is, most of the time, smarter people than us had looked at it, and they were right. You couldn't do anything about it. But occasionally we'd find a seam, we'd find a gap, we'd find some clause in some contract somewhere that let us sort of change direction. And so it became one of the management techniques was, what are the things that are untouchable? Because I want to touch them. I want to see what might actually underlie this. The other thing was, you read these books about business structure and business strategy and how to be successful. And how many times over the years have we worked for bosses who said, I hate surprises. Don't ever surprise me. My guidance to my teams, particularly the strategic technology team and the incubator teams that I ran, were, I want a surprise every week. Go away and find something we didn't know. Find something we didn't suspect. Maybe it's a market thing. Maybe it's a technology thing. Maybe it's a whatever. But your job is to surprise me every week with something. Now, I understand at some level the thinking about not liking surprises. And yes, there are some things you don't want to be surprised about. But one of the speeches I give to founders is, you guys, clearly, there's no way you know everything you need to know about whatever it is you're working on. So task people with surprising you every day, right? Find something to learn in your field, in your area, in your market, in your industry often, and be surprised. And it's, a few times we've been surprised in the wrong direction, but mostly it's been a great learning experience and makes us better.
There we go. There you are, folks. You heard it from the sage. Rick, genius. And it's always a pleasure. So until next time, Rick, I hope you'll come back and carry on this topic, because I think if there's any topic that deserves more visibility at the moment, it is decision quality under uncertainty. And decision acceleration, because right now there is so much coming at us, so much change, so much data, that us mere mortals need to find a clear way through, not only when things are going normally in steady state, but certainly when the crisis hits. What do we do to get it right? Rick's details, all of Rick's contact details will be below here in the show notes. And I invite you to contact Rick and gain more from this great pool of wisdom that sits alongside me here today. So, Rick, great to see you again. It's been too long, and we look forward to seeing you again very, very soon on the Just Great People podcast.
Absolutely, Barry. Thanks again. I always enjoy these.
And so do I. Thank you. So that's it for today's Just Great People podcast from the Success Consultancy. We hope and trust you've enjoyed it. Please join us next time, and please do remember to subscribe. Thanks for joining us.